On the 30th of January 1943, Adolf Hitler signed the most extraordinary promotion in military history. It was not a reward, it was a death sentence. The recipient was General Oberst, or Colonel General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the beleaguered German Sixth Army trapped at Stalingrad, and the man knew it immediately for what it was, an invitation to commit suicide. His response would seal his fate in history and enrage the Führer in equal measure. While many remember Stalingrad as the great turning point of the Second World War, fewer recall the bizarre and murky circumstances surrounding Paulus's final hours of command. This is where things took a turn towards the extraordinary, for in the freezing cellar of a ruined department store, surrounded by the frozen corpses of 250,000 men, a Roman Catholic field marshal would make a choice that no German officer of his rank had made in the entire recorded history of the German-speaking peoples. He would choose to live. To understand why a field marshal would betray a 200-year-old code of honor, we must first understand the man who was never meant to lead an army. Friedrich Wilhelm Ernst Paulus was born on the 23rd of September 1890 in the small Hessian village of Cuxhaven. He was not of aristocratic stock, though many English-language sources erroneously bestow upon him the noble prefix von. His father was a school treasurer, a modest civil servant. Young Friedrich harbored dreams of joining the Kaiserliche Marine, the Imperial German Navy, but failed to secure a cadetship. He briefly studied law at Marburg University before departing without taking a degree, a fact that would later contribute to his reputation as an intellectual officer, albeit one lacking in practical command experience. In February 1910, Paulus joined the 111th Infantry Regiment as an officer cadet. He was promoted to lieutenant or second lieutenant the following year. On the 4th of July 1912, he married Elena Constance Rosetti Solescu, a woman of Romanian aristocracy. From that moment forward, Paulus adopted an aristocratic manner. His fellow officers would later recall his obsession with personal cleanliness, maintaining immaculate appearance, even in the most gruesome battlefields. His men nicknamed him Der Lord for his refined bearing and fastidious nature. When the First World War erupted in August 1914, Paulus's regiment thrust into France. He saw action in the Vosges Mountains and around Arras that autumn. After a period of illness, he joined the Alpenkorps as a staff officer, serving in Macedonia, France, Romania, and Serbia. He distinguished himself not through bold leadership, but through meticulous staff work. By the armistice in November 1918, he had attained the rank of Hauptmann or captain. The pattern was established. Paulus was a man of paper, not of fire and blood. After the war, Paulus fought briefly with the Freikorps in the east as a brigade adjutant during the chaotic period of Germany's revolution and counter-revolution. When the Versailles Treaty reduced the German military to the skeleton Reichswehr, Paulus was one of only 4,000 officers retained. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, assessment reports consistently described him as a highly competent desk officer who, and here I quote, lacked decisiveness during practical troop maneuvers. When he served as an instructor at Infantry Schule Femme, the infantry school, his students gave him an unflattering sobriquet, the ditherer. Yet Paulus possessed qualities that attracted the attention of senior commanders. In 1935, he was appointed Chief of Staff for the Panzer Headquarters, where he caught Adolf Hitler's eye. He was methodical, thorough, utterly loyal. In August 1940, he was promoted to General Lieutenant or Lieutenant General and named Deputy Chief of the German General Staff. In this capacity, Paulus helped draft the operational plans for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. His fingerprints were all over the maps that would send 3 million men eastward in June 1941. In December 1941, following the death of General Feldmarschall or Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau, Hitler agreed that Paulus should be given command of the Sixth Army, then the largest single formation in the Wehrmacht. Promoted to General der Panzertruppe or General of Armored Troops, Paulus took up his appointment on the 1st of January 1942. He had never commanded a regiment. Now he commanded an army of 250,000 men. Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, described Paulus as brilliantly clever, conscientious, hard-working, original, and talented, but Guderian harbored doubts about his decisiveness, his toughness, and his lack of command experience. These doubts would prove prophetic. Paulus fought his first battle at Dnipropetrovsk in the Soviet Union. The advance of the Sixth Army was halted by the Red Army, and in February 1942, Paulus was forced to order his men to withdraw to better defensive positions. Then came a test. On the 9th of May 1942, General Semyon Timoshenko, commanding 640,000 Soviet troops, attacked the Sixth Army at Volchansk. Paulus, seriously outnumbered, made the prudent decision to fall back toward Kharkov. The situation appeared desperate until General Paul von Kleist and his 1st Panzer Army struck Timoshenko's exposed southern flank on the 17th of May. Paulus launched a counterattack on the 20th of May, and by month's end, all Soviet resistance had ceased. Approximately 240,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. For this victory, Paulus was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. Hitler now had confidence in his new army commander. In June 1942, the Führer launched Fall Blau, or Operation Blue, the great summer offensive aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus. The Sixth Army would lead the assault, with a deadline of the 25th of August, for the capture of a city that bore the name of Hitler's greatest ideological enemy, Stalingrad. The advance across the Don Steppe was brutal. Fuel shortages plagued the operation as Hitler changed plans repeatedly, diverting resources south toward the Caucasus. By late July, Paulus's panzers were running on fumes. The heat was oppressive, temperatures reaching 40 degrees Celsius. Dust choked engines and throats alike. Still, the Sixth Army pressed on, covering nearly 500 kilometers in 6 weeks. By the 23rd of August, 1942, German forces reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. That evening, 600 aircraft of Luftflotte 4 under General Oberst, or Colonel General Alexander Löhr, unleashed a devastating aerial bombardment on the city. Anywhere from 25,000 to 40,000 Soviet civilians died in a single week of bombing. The city, once beautiful, home to 600,000 souls, was transformed into a landscape from hell. Flames consumed entire districts. The Volga River ran red with blood and oil. The Sixth Army entered Stalingrad in early September 1942. What followed was not war in any conventional sense. It was descent into an urban abattoir. Soviet defenders, under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, had devised a new form of warfare. They did not defend lines. They defended rubble. Every building became a fortress. Every basement a bunker. Snipers lived in chimneys. Machine gun nests occupied collapsed balconies. German soldiers found themselves fighting for individual floors of factory buildings, for staircases, for cellars. A Luftwaffe officer captured late in the battle described the fighting as Rattenkrieg, rat warfare. Paulus exercised command from well back, from a village called Golutinsky, some 48 kilometers west of the city. He was a staff officer at heart, uncomfortable with the chaos of frontline command. His strategy was methodical: divide the city into sectors, reduce each strong point systematically, carve the defenses into digestible enclaves. But Soviet resistance was anything but systematic. General Chuikov's tactics were aggressive, unpredictable, born of desperation. Whole battalions were lost between rows of broken buildings. The Sixth Army was bleeding to death in the ruins. By October 1942, Paulus controlled 90% of Stalingrad, but his casualties were catastrophic. Over 40,000 men had fallen since entering the city. When General Gustav von Wietersheim, commander of the 14th Panzer Corps, complained about the appalling losses, Paulus relieved him of command and replaced him with General Hans Hube. On the 4th of October, Paulus made a desperate plea to Hitler for reinforcements. A few days later, 5 engineer battalions and a panzer division arrived. It was not enough. The autumn rains came in late October, turning the roads into seas of glutinous mud. Supply convoys bogged down. The Wehrmacht, with its narrow-tracked vehicles, struggled in conditions where the Red Army's wide-tracked T-34 tanks excelled. German logistics began to falter just as Stalin poured 3 more armies into the city. Soviet losses were far higher than German, but Stalin had reserves. Paulus did not. On the 10th of November 1942, Paulus ordered one final major offensive to liquidate the remaining Soviet positions. For 2 days, his exhausted troops attacked with everything they had left. They took heavy casualties. Then, on the 19th of November, the world changed. Operation Uranus, the great Soviet counteroffensive, smashed into the Romanian and Hungarian armies, protecting the 6th Army's flanks north and south of the city. These Axis allies, poorly equipped and lacking anti-tank weapons, collapsed within 48 hours. By the 23rd of November, 7 Soviet armies had completed a double envelopment, linking up near the town of Kalach on the Don River, 120 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The 6th Army, along with substantial elements of the 4th Panzer Army and remnants of 2 Romanian divisions, approximately 290,000 men, were trapped in what the Germans called a kessel, a cauldron. Paulus immediately requested permission to break out. His corps commanders, all experienced officers, argued unanimously for an immediate withdrawal to the southwest before the Soviet ring hardened. But Hitler, ensconced in his headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia, over 2,000 kilometers from the battlefield, refused. He cited the symbolic importance of holding a city that bore Stalin's name. More practically, he feared that abandoning Stalingrad would expose the flanks of Army Group A, then operating in the Caucasus, to encirclement. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, made a fatal promise. He assured Hitler that his transport aircraft could deliver 500 tons of supplies daily to the encircled 6th Army. It was a fantasy. The Luftwaffe possessed nowhere near the required transport capacity. The distance from the nearest viable airfields was 160 to 200 kilometers. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses were formidable. Weather conditions over the steppe in winter were appalling. On a good day, the Luftwaffe managed to deliver 100 tons. On most days, far less. The 6th Army required a minimum of 700 tons per day simply to survive, let alone fight. By early December 1942, the temperature in the Kessel had plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, many still in summer uniforms, froze to death at their posts. Frostbite became epidemic. Horses died by the thousand. Their frozen carcasses were stacked as sandbags around defensive positions. When the horse meat ran out, soldiers turned to rats. Cases of typhus appeared. The field hospitals, overwhelmed and undersupplied, became charnel houses. 18,000 wounded lay in basements without anesthetics, without clean dressings, without heat. The smell of gangrene and death permeated the ruins. On the 11th of December 1942, General Feldmarschall Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate relief effort. His newly formed Army Group Dawn, spearheaded by the 57th Panzer Corps under General Friedrich Kirchner, attacked from the southwest. The plan was for Manstein's force to break through the Soviet encirclement and create a corridor through which the 6th Army could withdraw. But there was a fatal flaw in the plan. Hitler had not given Paulus permission to break out. Paulus, ever the obedient soldier, would not act without explicit orders. Manstein's panzers fought to within 48 kilometers of the Kessel's perimeter by the 19th of December. It was as close as they would get. The relieving force was too weak, the Soviet defenses too strong. Manstein sent increasingly urgent messages to Paulus. "Prepare your mobile forces, consolidate your position, break out toward us." But Paulus remained fixed. His remaining armored vehicles had fuel for only a 20-kilometer advance. More critically, he did not have Hitler's permission. On the 23rd of December, facing a massive Soviet counteroffensive elsewhere on the front, Manstein was forced to withdraw. The last chance for the 6th Army died on the frozen steppe. The Soviet High Command, sensing total victory, launched Operation Koltso or Operation Ring on the 10th of January 1943. 7 Soviet armies, supported by 7,000 field guns, launchers, and mortars, opened with the largest artillery bombardment of the war to that point. In one sector alone, Marshal Nikolai Voronov, commander-in-chief of the Red Army's artillery, concentrated 500 guns and howitzers and 450 multiple rocket launchers across a mere 12-kilometer attack front. It was the highest Soviet artillery density yet achieved. The earth itself seemed to convulse. The western half of the Stalingrad pocket collapsed within a week. On the 16th of January, Potomnik Airfield, the last functioning air bridge to the outside world, fell to Soviet forces. Resistance diminished rapidly as ammunition and food supplies ran out entirely. By the 25th of January, LI Corps Commander General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, a capable and realistic officer, told his divisional commanders to decide for themselves on the matter of surrender. Paulus immediately relieved him of command. Seydlitz-Kurzbach subsequently fled German lines under fire from his own side and personally surrendered to the Soviets. He would later become one of the most vocal members of the National Committee for a Free Germany. On the 24th of January, Paulus transmitted a message to Hitler that laid bare the catastrophe. Troops without ammunition or food. Effective command no longer possible. 18,000 wounded without any supplies or dressings or drugs. Further defense senseless. Collapse inevitable. Army requests immediate permission to surrender in order to save lives of remaining troops. Hitler's response was brief and unequivocal. Capitulation out of the question. Every day that the army holds out longer helps the whole front and draws away Russian divisions from it. By the 26th of January, the Kessel had been split in two. Paulus and his headquarters staff occupied the southern pocket in the city center. The northern pocket, cantered on the tractor factory, was commanded by General Karl Strecker of the 11th Corps. Communication between the two pockets ceased. Each was on its own. Over 91,000 men remained alive, most barely so. On the 30th of January 1943, it was the 10th anniversary of Hitler's ascension to power. The Führer was in a bitter mood. The great victories of 1940 and 41 seemed a lifetime ago. Now the Reich faced potential catastrophe in the east. That morning, sitting in his headquarters at the Wolfschanze or Wolf's Lair near Rastenburg, Hitler made a decision. He would promote Friedrich Paulus to General Feldmarschall or Field Marshal, the highest rank in the Wehrmacht after Reichsmarschall. The promotion was transmitted by radio to Paulus's headquarters in the early morning hours of the 31st of January. Paulus was asleep in the basement of the Univermag, the central department store of Stalingrad, a pre-war shopping emporium that now served as the nerve center for the dying army. The building, a 5-story structure with a distinctive rounded facade, had been reduced to a shell. Its upper floors were skeletal ruins open to the sky. The basement, however, remained relatively intact, protected by layers of rubble and sandbags. The headquarters commander knocked on the door of Paulus's small room. The General Feldmarschall awoke and sat up on his iron bed. He was unshaven, gaunt, his uniform hanging loose on his diminished frame. The headquarters commander handed him a slip of paper and said, "Congratulations, the rank of Field Marshal has been conferred upon you. The dispatch came early this morning." It was the last one. Paulus read the message. According to his aide, Oberst or Colonel Wilhelm Adam, who was present in the room, Paulus sat silent for a long moment. Then he said, and I quote, "One cannot help feeling it is an invitation to suicide. However, I am not going to do them such a favor. It is critical to understand what this promotion meant. In the entire recorded history of Prussia and Germany, no field marshal had ever been taken prisoner. Not one. It was an unwritten code, understood by every officer. If defeat was inevitable, a field marshal ended his life rather than endure the shame of captivity. Frederick the Great had established this tradition in the 18th century. It had been maintained through the Napoleonic Wars, through the Franco-Prussian War, through the First World War. A field marshal's baton represented not just rank, but an obligation to die with honor if circumstances required it. Hitler knew this. Paulus knew this. Every German officer knew this. The promotion was not subtle. It was Hitler's final order, communicated in a language any Prussian officer would comprehend. Commit suicide. At the Wolf's Lair, Hitler told his staff, and again I quote, "In deciding to promote him, I noted that there is no known record of a Prussian or German field marshal ever having surrendered. The implication is clear. But Friedrich Paulus, the immaculate staff officer, the ditherer, the man who had never commanded a regiment before being given an army, had one quality Hitler had not counted on. He was a devout Roman Catholic. For Paulus, suicide was not honorable, it was mortal sin. And he had no intention, as he would later tell fellow prisoners, of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal. a contemptuous reference to Hitler's rank during the First World War. Paulus also understood something else. His surrender might, just might, save the lives of the 91,000 men under his command. If he committed suicide, his officers, steeped in the Prussian military tradition, might feel obligated to fight to the last bullet, condemning every remaining soldier to death in the ruins. Paulus even forbade his men from standing atop their trenches to be shot by Soviet snipers, a common method of suicide among despairing soldiers. Shortly before dawn on the 31st of January, Paulus made another decision. He removed his wedding ring and signet ring from his fingers. One of the last aircraft departing the Kessel, a Heinkel He-111, was scheduled to take off from a makeshift airstrip on the southern edge of the pocket that morning. Paulus gave the rings to a staff officer with instructions to deliver them to his wife, Elena, in Germany. He knew he would never see her again. By sending the ring, he was psychologically ending his life as a husband before he ended his life as a commander. It was his final goodbye, the only farewell he could offer across the frozen wasteland that separated him from everything he had known. He had not seen Elena since the summer of 1942. He would never see her again. Elena Paulus died in 1949 while her husband was still in Soviet captivity, without ever learning his ultimate fate from his own lips. At approximately 7 o'clock on the morning of the 31st of January, 1943, the headquarters commander once again entered Paulus's room. This time his message was blunt. "At the same time, I have to inform you that the Russians are at the door." With these words, he opened the door, and a Soviet general and his interpreter entered the room. The first Soviet officer to enter the basement of the Univermag was Senior Lieutenant Fyodor Mikhailovich Ilchenko of the 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade. Years later, Ilchenko described the scene in vivid detail. The basement was, and I quote, "packed with soldiers, hundreds of them. You could not move a finger in such a crowd. It was worse than any tramcar. They were dirty and hungry. And did they look scared? They had all fled down here to get away from the mortar fire outside. The smell was indescribable. Human excrement, urine, gangrene, and death filled the air. The filth, according to another Soviet officer, Major Anatoly Zoldatov, was piled up waist-high. Ilchenko and his men, weapons at the ready, descended the stairs. Hearing gunfire, Ilchenko grabbed for his holster, but the shots were from suicides, not resistance. German soldiers choosing death over captivity. The Soviet negotiators were met by Major General Friedrich Roske, commander of the Wehrmacht's 71st Infantry Division, and General Lieutenant or Lieutenant General Arthur Schmidt, Paulus's chief of staff. Schmidt, wearing a distinctive leopard skin cap, was a fanatical Nazi, far more committed to the ideology than Paulus himself. The two Germans led the Soviet officers to Paulus's room. Paulus was lying on an iron cot. He wore no tunic, only his shirt. His field marshal's shoulder boards had not yet been affixed to any uniform. The promotion was mere hours old. He had a 2-week growth of beard. Lieutenant Colonel Leonid Vinokour, another Soviet officer present, later recalled, he had lost all courage. He lay there in his coat, with his cap on. The surrender negotiations were handled not by Paulus himself, but by Roske and Schmidt. Paulus, in an extraordinary act of denial, claimed to Soviet interrogators that he had not surrendered. He said he had been taken by surprise, that the Soviets had simply arrived at his headquarters, and he had been captured. It was a fiction that would haunt him. When later questioned by the NKVD, Paulus insisted he was not responsible for the Southern Pocket's capitulation and denied he had any authority to order the Northern Pocket under General Strecker to surrender. But the facts were clear. At approximately 9 o'clock on the morning of the 31st of January, Major General Ivan Laskin, Chief of Staff of the 64th Army, formally accepted the capitulation of the Southern Pocket of German forces in Stalingrad. Paulus and 22 other generals, along with 3,000 Romanians and 91,000 Germans, marched into captivity. They emerged from cellars and basements, from sewers and bunkers, hands raised, hollow-eyed, more dead than alive. The Northern Pocket under General Strecker continued to resist for 2 more days. On the morning of the 2nd of February 1943, Strecker transmitted a final message to Army Group Don. The 11th Army Corps, consisting of 6 divisions, has fulfilled its duty by the heaviest fighting to the very last. Hail to the Führer! Hail to Germany! At 9:20, an incomplete message was received. The Russians are penetrating, fighting, tractor works, then silence. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The statistics of the battle beggar comprehension. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers died defending the city. German and Axis losses exceeded 740,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Of the 91,000 Axis prisoners taken in the final capitulation, approximately 45,000 died on the forced marches to prisoner of war camps in Siberia. Another 40,000 perished in the camps themselves. Only about 6,000 would survive to return home in 1955, 12 years after their capture. It was the single greatest military disaster in German history. When news of Paulus's surrender reached Hitler's headquarters at the Wolfschanze on the afternoon of the 1st of February 1943, the Führer flew into one of his most spectacular rages. Witnesses described him as nearly apoplectic. He had promoted Paulus to field marshal precisely to avoid this outcome, to ensure that the commander would either die fighting or take his own life. The fact that Paulus had chosen neither option was, to Hitler, an act of profound betrayal. Hitler summoned his staff and launched into a venomous tirade. According to stenographic records preserved from the conference, Hitler raged, "What is life? Life is the nation. The individual must die anyway. But how can one fear this moment through which one can free oneself from misery, if one's duty does not chain one to this vale of tears?" In peacetime Germany, about 18,000 or 20,000 people a year chose to commit suicide, even without being in such a position. Here is a man who sees 50,000 or 60,000 of his soldiers die defending themselves bravely to the end. How can he surrender himself to the Bolshevists? Hitler continued, his voice rising. Paulus could have freed himself from all sorrow and ascended into eternity and national immortality, but he prefers to go to Moscow. What hurts me most personally is that I still promoted him to field marshal. I wanted to give him this final satisfaction. That is the last field marshal I shall appoint in this war. This, incidentally, proved to be untrue. Hitler would go on to appoint 7 more field marshals during the final 2 years of the war, but in that moment, his fury was genuine. He predicted, correctly as it turned out, that Paulus would collaborate with the Soviets. "He will be in the Lubyanka," Hitler spat, referring to the notorious NKVD headquarters and prison in Moscow, "and the rats will eat him." In Nazi Germany, the propaganda machine immediately went to work attempting to control the narrative. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, declared a nationwide 3-day period of mourning. The official line was that the 6th Army had fought to the last man and been annihilated. No mention was made of the 91,000 prisoners. Hitler even ordered a symbolic funeral for Paulus, with a field marshal's baton placed atop an empty coffin. The regime attempted to conceal from German citizens the humiliating truth that the youngest German field marshal in history had been taken alive. Meanwhile, Paulus began his long journey into captivity. After a brief interrogation at the headquarters of the 64th Army commanded by General Nikolai Shumilov, Paulus was transported to the Don Front headquarters in the village of Zavarikino, where a small house had been prepared for his accommodation. There, on the 1st of February, he was interrogated by Marshal Nikolai Voronov, Stalin's personal representative at Stalingrad, and General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commander of the Don Front. The Soviets were initially cautious, almost deferential. Paulus was the highest-ranking German officer captured during the entire war. Stalin saw enormous propaganda value in his captivity, but Paulus, in those early days and months, remained loyal to Germany, if not to Hitler personally. He refused to cooperate with Soviet efforts to induce him to make anti-Nazi broadcasts. He declined to call upon German forces to surrender. He maintained a dignified, if defeated, silence. For over a year, Paulus resisted all Soviet blandishments. He was held in relatively comfortable conditions at various locations near Moscow, afforded reasonable treatment, supplied with books and writing materials. The NKVD placed agents fluent in German near him to monitor his conversations with other captured generals. These transcripts, preserved in Soviet archives, reveal a man deeply conflicted traumatized by the catastrophe of Stalingrad, questioning his own decisions, but not yet ready to betray the German military tradition entirely. Then came a series of devastating blows that would shatter Paulus's resolve and transform him into Hitler's most prominent German critic. The first blow fell in February 1944, when Paulus learned that his elder son, Hauptmann, or Captain Friedrich Paulus Jr., had been killed in action at the beachhead of Anzio in Italy on the 29th of February. He was 25 years old. The younger son, Ernst Alexander Paulus, had been wounded at Stalingrad and evacuated before the final collapse. But Ernst's fate would also be dark. He would later be arrested by the Gestapo and would ultimately survive the war only to commit suicide in 1970 at the age of 52. The second and more decisive blow came in July 1944. On the 20th of July, a group of German military officers, led by Oberst or Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb at the Wolfschanze. The plot failed. Hitler survived with minor injuries. What followed was a bloodbath. Hitler unleashed a wave of executions that consumed not just the conspirators, but anyone suspected of disloyalty, however tangential. Among those executed were two generals Paulus knew well and respected: General Oberst, or Colonel General Erich Hübner, and General Feldmarschall Erwin von Witzleben. Both had been senior officers of impeccable military credentials. Both had concluded that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction and had joined the resistance. Both were arrested, subjected to show trials before the notorious People's Court under Judge Roland Freisler, and hanged with piano wire from meat hooks at Plötzensee prison in Berlin. The executions were filmed on Hitler's orders. When Paulus learned of these deaths, something fundamental changed within him. If officers of Hübner's and Witzleben's stature had stood against Hitler, then perhaps Hitler himself was the traitor to Germany, not those who opposed him. Paulus later told his Soviet captors that the July 20th plot and its bloody aftermath convinced him that National Socialism represented not Germany's salvation, but its damnation. In August 1944, Paulus made his decision. He would collaborate with the Soviets, not out of ideology, but out of a conviction that ending the war as quickly as possible was the only way to save Germany from total annihilation. He joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, or National Komitee Freies Deutschland, a Soviet-sponsored organization of German prisoners of war who broadcast appeals to German soldiers to desert or surrender. On the 8th of August 1944, Paulus made his first public broadcast on Radio Moscow, transmitted in German to the Wehrmacht. His message was extraordinary, a complete repudiation of everything he had fought for. He declared, "This is a war started by Hitler in peacetime, a war of conquest and pillage the likes of which the world has never seen, fought with methods which are unprecedented in world history." He called upon German general officers to disobey Hitler's orders, to stop the senseless bloodshed, to save what remained of Germany. The impact in Germany was seismic. The regime had claimed Paulus was dead, killed heroically at Stalingrad. Now he was speaking on Soviet radio, condemning the war, calling for surrender. Goebbels worked furiously to convince the German public that the broadcasts were fabrications, that an actor was impersonating Paulus. But the field marshal's distinctive voice, his measured cadence, his intimate knowledge of military affairs were unmistakable. It was genuinely him. Hitler's response was characteristically vicious. He ordered that Paulus's entire family be imprisoned under the Nazi policy of Sippenhaft, or kin liability. Paulus's wife, Elena, and his daughter, Olga von Kutschenbach, were arrested by the Gestapo. Elena, who had never trusted the Nazis and who refused to renounce her husband despite being given the opportunity to save herself, was held in brutal conditions. She survived the war, but died in 1949, broken in health, never having seen her husband again after he departed for the Eastern Front in the summer of 1942. Throughout 1944 and 1945, Paulus continued his broadcasts. He appeared at press conferences in Moscow. He met with other German prisoners and urged them to join the Free Germany movement. The Soviets used him expertly, parading him as proof that even the Wehrmacht's senior commanders recognized the justice of the Soviet cause. It was propaganda, certainly, but Paulus appears to have believed, or convinced himself to believe that he was serving Germany's true interests. When the war in Europe ended on the 8th of May 1945, Paulus remained in Soviet custody. Unlike the vast majority of German prisoners, he was not consigned to the labor camps of Siberia. Stalin had other plans for his prize captive. In 1946, Paulus was transported to Nuremberg to testify at the International Military Tribunal, the Great War Crimes Trial of Nazi Germany's surviving leadership. On the 11th of February 1946, General Feldmarschall Friedrich Paulus entered the courtroom at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg as a witness for the prosecution. It was an extraordinary moment. In the dock sat Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and Hitler's designated successor, Wilhelm Keitel, General Feldmarschall and Chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, and Alfred Jodl, General Oberst and Chief of the Operations Staff. These were the men who had commanded Germany's military machine. Now they faced judgment, and one of their own had come to testify against them. Paulus appeared in full uniform, wearing the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves, his medals from both world wars, but conspicuously not his field marshal's insignia. He was gaunt, pale, and visibly uncomfortable. The German defendants stared at him with expressions ranging from contempt to disbelief. Göring, in particular, regarded Paulus with undisguised loathing. He later instructed his lawyer to ask Paulus a pointed question. Does he know he is a traitor? Has he taken out Russian citizenship papers? Paulus's testimony focused on the planning and execution of Operation Barbarossa. He testified that the invasion of the Soviet Union had been a war of aggression, unprovoked, planned in peacetime, in violation of the German-Soviet non-aggression pact. He described the criminal orders issued by the Wehrmacht High Command, including the Commissar Order which mandated the execution of captured Soviet political officers, and the Severity Order which authorized collective reprisals against civilians. His testimony was devastating, delivered calmly and methodically, the staff officer presenting his findings. But Paulus's testimony at Nuremberg was also marked by a profound dishonesty. When a journalist asked him about the fate of the Stalingrad prisoners, Paulus replied that they were well, that they were being treated humanely. This was a grotesque lie. Paulus knew, or should have known, that of the 91,000 men who surrendered with him, over 90% were already dead, having perished on the death marches or in the camps. Yet he maintained the fiction, whether out of denial, cowardice, or complicity with his Soviet handlers. It remains one of the most troubling aspects of his captivity. Paulus remained in the Soviet Union until 1953. The conditions of his detention were relatively benign compared to other prisoners, but he was still a captive, still subject to Soviet control. During these years, he wrote extensively about military history and strategy, materials that would later be published in East Germany. He lived in reasonable comfort in various locations near Moscow, but he was isolated, cut off from his family, uncertain of his future. In 1953, 2 years before the general repatriation of German prisoners of war from the Soviet Union, Paulus was granted permission to move to the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. It was a propaganda coup for the communist regime in East Berlin. The field marshal who had defied Hitler now chose, at least nominally, to live under socialism rather than return to the capitalist Federal Republic in the West. Paulus settled in Dresden, in the district of Oberloschwitz, in a modest villa provided by the state. He was appointed the civilian chief of the East German Military History Research Institute, a position that was largely honorific, but allowed him to continue his writing. He held press conferences where he spoke about the vital issues facing the German nation, carefully echoing the Communist Party line. But Paulus's life in Dresden was marked by profound loneliness and loss. He returned to discover that his beloved wife, Elena, had died 4 years earlier. His son Friedrich was dead. His surviving son, Ernst, was psychologically shattered and would later take his own life. His daughter Olga had survived her imprisonment, but their relationship was strained. The German public, both East and West, regarded him with suspicion and contempt. To many Germans, he was a traitor who had sided with the enemy. To others, he was a war criminal who had presided over the destruction of the Sixth Army and then escaped justice. Paulus became a recluse. Neighbors in Dresden recalled seeing him occasionally, always alone, walking slowly, a tall, gaunt figure in civilian clothes. He attended no social functions. He formed no friendships. The social world had rejected him utterly. He lived in what one acquaintance described as psychological misery, haunted by Stalingrad, by the men who had died under his command, by the choices he had made and the choices he had failed to make. On the 2nd of July, 1954, Paulus gave his final major press conference in Berlin. He spoke about the dangers of German rearmament, the importance of peaceful coexistence, the lessons of the late unpleasantness. His words were those of the East German state, but his delivery was listless, mechanical. The fire had long since gone out. In late 1956, Paulus began experiencing strange symptoms. His hands trembled, his speech became slurred. He had difficulty walking. Doctors diagnosed amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a devastating degenerative disease of the motor neurons, the same condition that would later afflict the physicist Stephen Hawking. There is no cure. The progression is relentless. Paulus became progressively weaker, his body gradually paralyzing while his mind remained intact, a particularly cruel fate for a man already imprisoned by guilt and isolation. Friedrich Paulus died in Dresden on the 1st of February 1957, exactly 14 years to the day after the southern pocket of Stalingrad capitulated. He was 66 years old. The official cause of death was listed as complications from motor neuron disease, though some sources also mention cancer. He died alone in his villa, attended only by medical staff. There were no family members present. As part of his last will and testament, Paulus requested that his body be transported to West Germany, to Baden-Baden, to be buried in the Hauptfriedhof, the main cemetery, next to his wife, Elena. It was his final act of separation from the regime he had served in his last years. The East German authorities, perhaps recognizing they had squeezed all possible propaganda value from him, allowed it. His body was transported across the border and interred in Feld 9, Row 1, Graves 4 and 5, beside the woman he had loved and not seen for 15 years. The funeral was small, attended by a handful of distant relatives and military historians. No senior German officials, East or West, attended. No military honors were rendered. The field marshal who had commanded 250,000 men, who had defied Hitler, who had turned against his own army, was buried in obscurity, mourned by virtually no one. Paulus's legacy remains deeply contested. To some, he was a competent staff officer promoted beyond his abilities, a man who lacked the decisiveness to break out of Stalingrad when he had the chance and the moral courage to disobey Hitler's suicidal stand-fast orders. To others, he was a man trapped between impossible choices, who ultimately chose life over death and conscience over blind loyalty. His decision to join the National Committee for a Free Germany and testify at Nuremberg is seen by some as genuine moral awakening and by others as collaboration with the enemy born of weakness and self-preservation. What is beyond dispute is that on the morning of the 31st of January 1943, in a freezing cellar beneath a ruined department store, Friedrich Paulus made a choice that no German field marshal had made in centuries. When presented with Hitler's silent order to die, he chose to live. Whether that choice redeemed him or damned him remains, 7 decades later, a matter of fierce debate. The Univermag department store in Stalingrad, now Volgograd, survived the war in ruins. It was partially reconstructed, though it lost its top floor, and its iconic rounded facade was hidden behind the post-war Intourist hotel. The basement where Paulus surrendered was sealed and forgotten for decades. In 2003, for the 60th anniversary of the battle, it was opened as the Museum Pamyat, the Museum of Memory. The rooms where Paulus and his staff spent their final hours of command have been preserved, recreated with period furniture, sandbags in the windows, and a gray-faced mannequin of Paulus standing in his final uniform, staring at the floor. Visitors to Volgograd today can descend into that basement, can walk through those corridors, can stand in the room where one of history's most extraordinary military dramas reached its conclusion. The walls are witnesses to what transpired there in January 1943, when a field marshal looked at a promotion and recognized it for what it was, an invitation to die. And when he looked at his starving, freezing, dying men and decided that he would not give the Bohemian corporal that satisfaction. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share.